As president, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present dangers. And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
Welcome back to Outside Counsel. I'm your host, Jeffrey B. Simon. Today, I have the great pleasure of chatting with New York Times best-selling author and journalist, Jeff Goodell. His latest book, The Heat Will Kill You First, describes how extreme heat events wrought by carbon pollution kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, and why the death toll will keep rising.
I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area. I was a big hunter and outdoorsman as a kid. Did a variety of odd jobs, including dealing blackjack in a casino in Lake Tahoe, and worked at Apple Computer in the early days when Steve Jobs was running around barefoot and shouting Bob Dylan lyrics at everybody. I gave all that up and moved to New York. Went to graduate school there and got into journalism. Started writing about crime and politics in New York City. And then in 2001, which was 23 years ago now, the New York Times asked me to go write about the comeback of the coal industry in West Virginia. And it turned into a big story that was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And it changed my life. Ever since then, I've been writing about climate and energy. It's the great story of our time. So I've been on the kind of climate and energy beat now for 23 years. I've written 7 books and thousands of articles.
Your brilliant recent book about human-made climate change, The Heat Will Kill You First. What inspired you to write the book?
I can pinpoint exactly what inspired me to write this book. It was the summer of 2018. I was in Phoenix, Arizona to do some reporting for an unrelated story. I had a meeting and I was late for my meeting, and my Uber was late for picking me up. So I decided that I would just run the 20 blocks downtown, across town to my meeting. Unfortunately, it was 115 degrees that day, and it was probably because of the urban heat island effect, which we can discuss later if you'd like. It was probably 130 degrees in downtown Phoenix. And by the time I made it to my meeting, 20 blocks later, I was lightheaded and dizzy, and my heart was pounding. And I literally thought to myself, oh my God, it's so hot, this heat could kill you. And if I had to go another 20 blocks or something. And that might sound like a sort of ordinary thing to understand, except that I had been writing about climate change for almost 20 years at that time. And the phrase global warming gives you a hint that heat is involved in this story. But it never occurred to me how dangerous it really was. It was always some sort of abstract idea about melting ice sheets or distant sea level rise or droughts and things like that. It never felt like personal in that way. And that was literally the moment when I decided, if I don't understand how dangerous this is, then I bet a lot of other people don't either. And that's when the book was born.
What are some of the key points you hope readers will take from this narrative?
Most of us think that we understand heat, think that obviously we all talk about the weather all the time. We all understand what it's like to be in a warm place, and many of us prefer to be in warm places. And this heat is not just an abstraction, something that is melting glaciers far away. It's something that can really endanger you and can endanger me and can endanger people that we love. And I really wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about literally what it does to the human body, what happens during a heat stroke. One reviewer compared my book to a horror novel because of the nuanced details of what heat does, but I was very happy about that because I really wanted to have a visceral feeling as one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it was to think about heat as this sort of larger force that's behind all of the impacts that we think of when we think about climate change, from sea level rise to drought to wildfires. I call it in the book the engine of planetary chaos, because it really is this rising heat levels that are driving all these other changes.
To that end, you write, in this book, my goal is to convince you to think about heat in a different way. Heat as an active force, one that can bend railroad tracks and kill you before you even understand that your life is at risk. You felt that personally that day in Phoenix, didn't you?
I did feel it personally, and I was really surprised. It's not like I was some kind of babe in the woods or something, but that moment, that day, I really understood that I didn't understand how dangerous this really was. And I didn't understand how our body works in reaction to heat. And I didn't understand how quickly heat can kill you.
Let's talk about heat first at its elemental level and then scope. What is heat?
I think that many people don't know what heat is. And it was part of a great kind of pursuit in the 18th century to really understand what was heat. There was a lot of belief that it was some kind of invisible force, this sort of invisible liquid in the sky, in the air. There are a lot of different theories. In fact, our word calories comes from this early idea of caloric theory of heat. To be brief about it, heat is really, you can think about it as vibration. It is about molecules vibrating more quickly. So when you put your hand on a coffee cup and you feel the warmth on your fingertips, no fluid or anything or nothing is being transferred between the coffee cup and your hand. What's happening is the coffee cup molecules are vibrating faster and they're transferring that faster vibration to the molecules in your fingertips. And our neural system picks that up as and registers it in our brains as heat. And so when you think about a hotter world, a hotter body, one way to think about it is a world as a body, as a thing that is vibrating faster, moving faster, has a higher metabolism.
And temperature is the average speed of the vibration of a collection of molecules.
Exactly.
So when something is cold, the average speed of the vibration of the molecules of that thing is slower. And when something is hot, the vibration rate is higher.
Precisely.
What is the primary cause of the increase of the surface temperature of the Earth that you've been describing?
Oh, well, it's very straightforward. It's higher CO2 levels in the atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels. 100% of the sort of increase of temperature that we've seen essentially since the Industrial Revolution, since the pre-industrial time, which is the sort of baseline that scientists use to measure this thing called climate change and global warming. This baseline that many of us who think about climate change hear about, these temperature thresholds of 1.5 C or 2.0 C of warming that scientists have identified as these sort of dangerous, these thresholds for dangerous change on our planet. Those are all measured from this sort of pre-industrial base. And it's very well established. It's been very well established for 100 years what that warming is coming from. And it's coming from burning oil, coal, and gas, which creates CO2, which goes into the atmosphere. That CO2 acts like a kind of, it's been described by many scientists as a sort of blanket that traps this sort of heat in our upper atmosphere. But the thing that's really, I think, not understood by a lot of people, including me, until I really started thinking about this, I grew up in California. We had smog, and then catalytic converters were installed on cars, and smog went away and the skies cleared up. It's really important to understand that CO2 and the warmth that it causes is not like that. CO2 does not dissipate out of the sky for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So you can think of it as virtually permanent. And the more we add to it every day, every ton, it accumulates more. And so that's why it's getting hotter. And it also means that if we get to some magical net zero moment, it doesn't mean that it's going to go back to the way it used to be. That all that will do is stop the further increase. And that's very different than what we think about with typical kind of air pollution, which goes away as soon as you stop. Once we put catalytic converters on cars, the skies were blue again. That's not what's going to happen here.
Let's talk about that a little bit. The Earth is hotter permanently than it used to be before we were burning fossil fuels like oil and coal as much as we have been.
There's a little caveat with permanently, because there's the natural CO2 weathering process that over hundreds and thousands of years will pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But for all intents and purposes, on human scale timeframes, permanently is accurate, but not on geologic timeframes. But yes.
How much hotter have we made the Earth by the burning of fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide, abbreviated CO2, into the atmosphere?
the scientists measure this by global averages, which it smooths out irregularities, heat waves, things like that into a kind of global average. And right now we're at about 1.2 C warmer than we were in pre-industrial times. So that's about 1.7 or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, which doesn't sound like a lot. You say to somebody, instead of 78 degrees, it's 80 degrees. That sounds like nothing. And one of the difficulties in communicating about heat and writing about heat in this book is helping people understand the enormous consequences of what sound like small changes. But to directly answer your question, about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer.
And you explain in the book so effectively. Don't think about whether or not it's 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on a particular day, or than it was this time last year, or even than it used to be about this time last year. Think about the extreme changes in climate that are created by that kind of effectively permanent temperature rise.
There's a difference between climate and weather, right? Climate is long-term weather averages. Weather is the thing that you get when you walk outside your door. And the weather system is very chaotic, right? And one of the things that's happening is as our planet warms, as we move from 1.7 degrees of warming to 2 degrees of warming, is that it's changing the sort of atmospheric dynamics in a very powerful way. It's shifting where the jet stream goes. The temperature differences between the poles and the tropical zones are getting less, and that's changing the path of the jet stream. It's changing the circulation patterns of the ocean. It's changing how much heat the ocean is sucking up. All these things add up to radically different planet and weather systems, because the not only is the temperature rising, but the balance of temperature on our planet is different. For example, I live in Austin, Texas. Last summer, we had a heat dome over Austin, where I live. We had 40 days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It was crazy. And it was 105 degrees and very humid also. It was, for me, who had just spent 3 years reporting a book about heat, it was brutal. But that happened because of these changes in the jet stream that trapped this mound of hot air over Texas during that summer. Similarly, in my book, I talk about the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 that hit Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. That was another example of a weather anomaly that was created by these shifting atmospheric patterns because of this larger warming. People always ask me, Jeff, where should I move to be safe from climate change? And of course, my answer is there's nowhere safe. You're going to be impacted anywhere, but there are better and worse places for all kinds of reasons that we could talk about sometime. But I often would point to Oregon and Washington and say, those are relatively cool places. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of trees. It's like probably better than being in Texas. And then they have this anomalous heat wave where you have 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120 degrees in that area for weeks at a time. You have towns in British Columbia spontaneously combusting. These are the kinds of things that you get when you start playing with this larger thermostat dial that we're doing as we burn CO2.
The sun radiates solar heat down upon the Earth, and that solar heat is reflected back from the planet's surface as infrared heat. Atmospheric carbon pollution from the burning of fossil fuels traps in that infrared heat rather than allowing it to dissipate, and then pushes it downward on all of us, which then causes the sky to vibrate faster, making us hotter. How much scientific agreement do you believe there is about that relationship we just discussed?
And among real scientists, the people that I talk to, the people that write the IPCC reports, the people that anybody who's a real scientist would look at and say, yes, that person's a real scientist, 100%. This is not complicated. This is really, there's been a lot of attempt to make this seem complicated, but virtually everyone who spends any time thinking about this and is at all seriously minded and doesn't come at this thinking that science is some kind of a religious faith or something that really understands that their physics have rules. The reason that we can fly in airplanes is because we understand physics. And the reasons airplanes don't crash very often at all is because we've gotten really good at figuring out what those rules are and how it all works. We step off a roof. I think most people realize if you step off of the roof and it's 15 feet to the ground, it doesn't matter what you think about science, you're going to hit the ground hard, right? And your opinions about physics and things like that are not going to soften the blow. It's the same thing here. This is very straightforward stuff. There is lots of nuance in the story of climate change, but it's not around this. The kind of mechanisms that you outlined are 100% straightforward.
Let's talk about the difference between hard science on this topic, disinformation on this topic, and magical thinking. You note that the 8 years between 2015 and 2022 were the hottest on record. Is there any chance that's a coincidence and not the result of the burning of fossil fuels releasing more trapping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
But now, because of the record in 2023, we're up to the hottest 10 years. These temperatures are rising because we are putting CO2 into the atmosphere, which we have known, scientists have known for more than 100 years, traps heat in precisely the way that you just described it.
Do you find that there is substantial public doubt, not scientific doubt, but public doubt about whether human-made climate change in the United States, set aside the world, is real?
There certainly are people who question it. I just came back literally yesterday from giving a talk at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, one of the ancestral home of the sort of environmental movement. Many great scientists emerged out of University of Wisconsin. John Muir went to college there, some of the great glaciologists. It's an epicenter of scientific understanding of climate and Earth's history. And my Uber driver, he asked me what I did, and I told him that I was there to give a talk about climate change. And my Uber driver went into this whole thing about how he has a friend who studies volcanoes, and his friend is telling him that it's all volcanoes and it's nothing to do with burning fossil fuels. That was yesterday. So yes, there are certainly people out there who doubt this. And I think that what I saw a survey a few months ago that there are still 17% of Americans think the earth is flat. Yeah, there's lots of people out there who think that this is some kind of conspiracy cooked up by Bill Gates or George Soros or a Chinese hoax or whatever. But I think that the percentage of people who think that is dwindling. I think that there's a certain number of people that will never be reached. But I do think that because of these changes that we're seeing in real time now, I do think that more and more people are accepting the scientific straightforwardness of this. After talking about this for almost 25 years, I've given up trying to reach the flat earth types who think that this is some kind of a hoax. I realize that nothing I'm going to say in 5 or 10 minutes is going to connect with them or reach them. And I just don't waste time with it. There's another part of it emerging, which is the sort of doomer crowd who feels that we're too far gone, that that climate is hopeless, that it's going to get hotter and hotter, faster and faster, that we're all doomed, that nothing we do matters, that, we may as well just party at the beach and watch the apocalypse arrive. Or people who decide not to have children because they think that the world will be in such chaos and heat by the time their children come of age that they don't want to participate in that way. The doomer side of it is, in a way, to me, more worrying, because that is just a kind of gliding towards apocalypse and not realizing that we have significant agency, that there's a lot of things that we can do to create a kind of future that we want.
So you have 3 categories of belief systems about this in the public. You have people who don't believe that climate change is real. You have people who do believe it and think we need to be taking steps to try to improve matters environmentally. And then you have people that are resigned to the outcome in their mind, which is nothing can be done, so why bother?
Yeah, and I would add to that middle category, there's more subtlety to that middle category. There are a lot of people who do accept the sort of science that you were talking about that we've just outlined here, but don't really see the urgency in it. They just think, okay, yeah, it's getting warmer, and yeah, someday I'm recycling my bottles and I'm doing the best I can. Maybe next year I'll think about buying an electric car or something like that, but are not really engaged in it, don't see it as an urgent problem. I think that there's a lot of that kind of middle ground of people who accept it, but don't really understand the risk and urgency and danger of it. And those are the people who I'm trying to reach in my book. That to me is the 60-70% of Americans who get this and understand this and believe and understand that science is not a religion and that this stuff is real and physics matters and all of that, but don't really get how dangerous and what the scope and scale of the changes that are coming our way really mean.
That certainly came through in your book, that you were trying to alert people to understand that this is, for every one of us, a first-person problem that poses enormous peril. And you describe extreme heat in your book as a force beyond anything we have reckoned with before. It may be a human creation, but it is godlike in its prophecy and power. Now, remembering that humans have created other implements of mass destruction, Jeff, and we created nuclear weapons and illicit fentanyl, how are you comfortable describing extreme heat as a force beyond anything we have reckoned before?
Look at Venus. Nothing is on Venus. Heat is an extinguishing force. If it gets too hot, living things die, and that's all living things. There's no living thing that if it gets too hot, it just thrives, right? And in that sense, it's different than a nuclear weapon or a biological agent or something like that are all terrifying, but they're not a kind of globally extinguishing force of all living things the way that heat is. And I'm not trying to say that if we don't all start driving electric cars and switch into heat pumps in the next 35 minutes, that we're all going to be extinguished. But the force that we're messing with here is the one that is the sort of operating system of life, which is our Earth's climate. And if we create a climate and we create a world that is inhospitable to life, then life won't exist. And that's, in its own way, I think, a far more powerful thing than the horror of an atomic weapon or something like that.
Thank you to my guest, Jeff Goodell, and thank you for tuning in. Join us next time for part 2 of our conversation, as Jeff offers a candid and harrowing assessment of how human-made climate change is destroying lives and communities at an alarming rate. This podcast is produced by Shannon McDees of Revel and Convey and Larry Shavana. The opinions expressed on Outside Counsel are neither legal nor medical advice. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers, guests, experts, and/or host. They do not expressly nor necessarily reflect the opinion of any institution with which I am or ever have been a member and should never be attributed as such. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Outside Counsel. I'm Jeffrey B. Simon.